Welcome everyone to today's webinar, The Future of Resilient Supply Chains, presented in partnership with BarTender. In today's webinar, we will take a deep dive into the important role of data, why we need it, where the data comes from, how we're using it, and the impact of real-time data on supply chain resilience. Now, on July 1st, BarTender released a report in partnership with Supply Chain Brain on the top threats impacting our supply chains. And it looked at the correlation between data and an organization's readiness to deal with those threats. My name is Bart De Muynck, and I will be your host for today's webinar. I've spent over 30 years in supply chain, both as a practitioner in the logistics provider and the shipper fields. I also spent 8 years with the research firm Gartner, and I worked at several tech companies. And currently, I'm an independent advisor and industry thought leader. And I'd like to welcome our guest experts from Zebra Technologies, Aptos, and Seagull Software. Thank you for joining us on the webinar today. Can you maybe each provide a quick introduction of your organization and the role that you play at your organization to our audience? And maybe we'll start with Tom.
Yes, hi everyone. Tom Bianculi here, Chief Technology Officer at Zebra, and I'm very much focused on incubating new solutions for the organization, looking at new technologies that are going to make their way into our roadmap and de-risking those, and then also looking at trends, dynamics, strategic themes by vertical. As we look at retail is a big part of our business, but certainly transportation, logistics, manufacturing, healthcare as well, and really understanding what's happening in those environments and informing our business teams and our strategy overall. So looking forward to the conversation today, Bart.
Well, welcome, Tom, and thank you for that intro. So let's go to Nikki.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm the VP of Strategy and Product at Aptos. I have been with the company for 8 years. I focus on the future and interpret that future for impact on our customers as well as our company and product direction. Aptos is an enterprise software provider focused wholly on the retail industry. We tend to be a bit more on the fashion side, but cover brands and general merchandise as well. So excited to bring that point of view to today's discussion.
Yeah, looking forward to the discussion, Nikki. And finally, we have Dan.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Bart. My name is Dan Qualiana. I'm the Senior Vice President of Product Management at Seagull Software. I've been with Seagull for a little over a year, and they brought me in as really looking to grow the BarTender brand from labeling into traceability. Really excited to be able to do this as we look at helping businesses track the data of their goods across their own environments as well as across supply chains. Before being at Seagull, I was at Zebra Technologies. I actually worked for Tom, working with data services and doing data analytics. So really excited to be talking with the audience here about what we can do with data and how we can leverage that through the supply chains.
Very cool. And obviously, we also want to welcome our audience. Please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A section of Zoom, and we will get to those questions at the end of the webinar. You kind of seen here an overview of kind of what the agenda is. We're going to start by kind of laying kind of the groundwork or the foundational technology and start the discussion there. And then we're going to really go all the way down to what's the future going to look like. So we'll give you a couple of different perspectives on the data and how we're using it, how we will be using it in the future. But as we start with that, I just want to kind of set a little bit the stage by defining supply chain resilience in today's business environment. And maybe people use different definitions, and I will say that that definition has changed over the year as well. But we all see it as, you know, an ability of a supply chain to anticipate, adapt, and recover from disruptions that we see, like natural disasters, pandemics, or geopolitical conflicts. And in today's business environment, where companies are facing more frequent disruptions and rapidly escalating customer expectations, resilience is really about more than just surviving. It's about emerging stronger as well as smarter. I will also say that resilience doesn't come at any cost like it did during the COVID era. Instead, companies really need to face these disruptions with a stronger and more profitable outcome. So resilience really has become a strategic imperative for every organization, independent of their size, that requires both a combination of technology, diversified sourcing, and really a culture of continuous adaptation to transform a supply chain from a point of vulnerability into a true strategic advantage. Now, we've seen quite a few trends out there, right? Obviously, we increasingly see the need to know where every item is and what condition it's in all the time across our global supply chains. And we've seen machine learning and generative AI coming that is thriving on these large data sets. But at the same time, brands are being pressured by regulators and consumers to prove their products are responsibly sourced and as well as environmentally sound. And so we're expecting visibility into where products come from and how they're made, and we want that at our fingertips. And that's really, kind of driving expectations around data and driving further data needs. But at the same time, we've witnessed an explosion of data. We've seen a shift to item level granularity. We see things like automation and IoT integration. And we've also evolved from episodic to continuous. And what that means is, instead of just using things like barcodes for snapshots, we're really looking to larger data sets that give us more information. So with that being said, I'm going to ask Tom the first question. Now, Zebra obviously has been at the forefront of this entire data revolution. So how have you seen the perception of data evolve from what used to be a simple record-keeping tool to a true strategic asset for customers, Tom?
Yeah, hey, Bart, thanks for the question, a great question. One of the things that we've definitely seen the conversation transition to with customers, if I use a little bit of the wording that we've adopted here at Zebra, is moving from the concept of innovation where systems of record are occurring, sort of the transactional data that you were mentioning, to what we've been terming as systems of reality. And that's working together with our partner ecosystem, like with Siegel and others. And what do we mean by that system of reality is not simply having kind of the planned view of what's going to be happening or is anticipated to happen in the operation, but literally being able to see that in real time. So where are my capital assets? Where are my people? Where is inventory? And being able to understand that in real time, which is just absolutely necessary. It's really become an imperative for our customers if they're going to operate at the speed of digital. So, if you think about the on-demand economy and the expectations that, consumers have in a B2C context, but also businesses have from a B2B point of view, it's that they can order pretty much in like an on-demand way, which has really changed the dynamic in terms of predictability, forecasting, the ability to react. And so you've really got to be pivoting your operations in kind of a streaming sort of way as opposed to batch, right? So, what you're going to do at 10 a.m. in the morning, you don't know what that's going to be at 9 a.m. in the morning. And so you've got to use this kind of real-time visibility to be able to do that. And I think that perception of data not as something that you kind of analyze and only use to kind of continuously improve your operations on a longer term scale, but that you're using in the moment to adjust the chessboard of your operations in real time. We've seen that perception of data very much evolve with our customers, and I know we'll talk about it later, but AI is something that is playing a huge role in the velocity and the veracity and the appetite for all of that data as well. So we'll chat about that more later.
Couldn't agree more with you, Tom. And I do like that term, system of reality, right? Because data doesn't always equal reality. So how do we get there? Now, Dan, we know that labeling provides a core data source for items. How have you seen new technologies like RFID, but also other IoT sensors, kind of improve access to more granular data, right? Think item tracking versus, for example, batch tracking for better item level visibility.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, really, over the last several decades, barcodes are proliferated everywhere, right? We see them, they're ubiquitous, but we've started seeing some advancements in that technology, whether that's, shifting from a 1D barcode to a 2D barcode that can provide more information, seeing RFID tags that, again, can hold more information. But then there's also the speed with which and that timeliness with which that data is coming in. So as we've seen rise of mobile RFID and now fixed RFID gives that real-time visibility and access, and especially machine vision as well, so that whether it's that barcode or RFID, companies can be tracking things in that real time. We've also seen a dramatic rise then in adoption of APIs. So really, every product that you see out there, there are going to be some form of APIs to be able to connect that data, easily share it across multiple systems, because there's never one system that has everything. And then why do people care? Well, I think Tom was getting to a lot of this, but ultimately, before people were tracking an individual good or maybe a type of good, now we're focusing more on once something has a serialized unique identification, there's a digital identity of that good. And that can then be shared across not only internal operations, but across the supply chain and across to many different companies. So those are some of these great growth areas that we are seeing this need for adoption. And whether you're a very large enterprise all the way down to a mom and pop shop or farm, we're seeing this growth of adoption. And that's part of our job, to really work with these companies across that full spectrum to help them be prepared for this future that's coming.
Well, those are great insights, Dan. And finally, Nikki, from a retailer's perspective, how have these foundational technology provided some of that data that we need to get better insight into things like inventory and enable more effective planning?
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes down to, if you can't see it, you can't measure it. And if you can't measure it, then you can't really effectively impact that measurement, right, to benefit the company. So have absolutely seen more and more interest in lighting up dark places within the enterprise, and supply chain has been one of the biggest places that's dark. In the retail context, the store has been dark. It's been nearly impossible to see inside those four walls with any degree of confidence or accuracy. So I think that system of reality, that also is becoming more and more important to retailers, but I think it's really been the execution side that has driven much more interest. So when I look at RFID, for example, it's been omni-channel, and wanting to be able to promise every scrap of inventory that's in a store to a customer that's online, and to be able to do so with confidence, that has really driven kind of the current level of interest in identification technologies that let you have much greater visibility into the real-time inventory that's in a store. So it's been interesting to see the what is driving the interest. It really, like, yes, you can make a case for, let's light up everything and figure out, where we have profit leakage, where we have holes that we need to plug. But I think the reality has been more pragmatic, in the sense of, I know I have this problem. I know now that identification technologies can help me solve this problem. So I'm going to apply it here. And then once you get that base established, then you start looking around for those other opportunities where you can be more holistic in your approach.
Yeah, very good. I think we're, a lot of the retailers trying to bring the store really into the supply chain, and maybe even try standardize that consumer experience. So data becomes a very important part of that. And again, I want to send out a reminder for our audience that you can put questions in the Q&A, and we'll answer those at the end of the discussion here. So if we switch a little bit more around data, and obviously start talking about things like data quality, because one thing is certain, we got more data than we've ever had, but data sometimes remains scattered around the enterprise. It's often not harmonized, and might be even bad or incomplete data. And the recent survey that was done, conducted by Siegel and Supply Chain Brain, revealed that data really has a strategic value, but it needs to be high quality real-time data. So a high percentage of respondents view the data as critical, or at least very important, for underpinning both key decisions, as well as significantly improving responsiveness. However, there's a stark contrast between that recognition and then the current state of data quality. And a substantial portion of organizations describe their overall supply chain data as fair. And that's due to data fragmentation that creates visibility issues. And a lot of them also said it's poor, and even very poor, indicating systemic data challenges that act as a barrier to performance. So really, a core focus area for companies should be to improve the data quality, especially when we start using data more and more, not just to do that historical analysis, but truly to predict prescribe and possibly automate processes. So let's turn that into some questions. And I'll start with you, Tom. What do you see as kind of the single biggest hurdle for companies to achieving that high quality, trusted data? And what is a step companies can take today to overcome it?
Yeah, so I think that we spoke a little bit about this in the opening here, is really around granularity and specificity of the data, and then the relationship among those various data elements. Because, and I think maybe Nikki touched on it before, the idea of just kind of collecting the data because you can is not going to really drive the business outcome. And even if you've got the business outcome in mind, extracting the insight becomes really critical. So, if you think about data ontologies that are looking at saying, hey, I don't just see maybe an RFID read, but I know that RFID read is a pallet. And so I start defining objects in that ontology. This is a pallet, this is a truck, this is a person. And then across those silos you were talking about, Bart, because that is certainly a challenge. How can you start to identify within that ontology the relationship of those objects in the physical world? So I've got this data. What is that data? First of all, do I have granular enough data to get the business outcome I want? And then what does that data represent in the physical world in terms of objects? And then understanding the relationship and the insights across those objects. And if you look at some of the standards that are out there, very much in the kind of domains we're talking about, like EPCIS, the Electronics Product Code Information Services, they're very much focused on that. Like the way EPCIS talks about their standard is understanding the what, when, where, how, and why behind data. So if you're doing, as was mentioned earlier, end-to-end supply chain tracking, maybe think about perishable items, and you want to look at, I don't know, a recall, or understanding which of those items made it to which end locations and over what period of time and under what kind of environmental conditions. You need that granularity and specificity I was mentioning. So you need serialization. You need fairly granular carton level, item level, maybe at the most pallet level tracking. And you've got to understand the relationship. So I know this pallet made it onto this vehicle, was exposed to these conditions, and I can look at the relationship across all of those. So I think there's a lot of focus often on the data collection side of it, but not as much on the ontology, the objects, and the relationship among those objects in the physical world. And that maybe is what is the definition of bad data. It's data that's not labeled and understood very often. And we're seeing a much bigger push in that direction. And there's entire ISVs, independent software vendors, and companies that are emerging to help bring those clarity against certain types of use cases.
Yeah, that's so true, Tom. And I definitely witnessed that firsthand when I was at PepsiCo, right? Where just to have the same data definition and same understanding of data metrics across the globe was a tremendous effort from a master data management perspective. Now, Dan, as we're getting more of that data and we're looking at the data quality, how do you see that? And is there also a need for change management to deal with kind of looking and approaching data differently?
Absolutely. Let me maybe just dive in on one very specific thing. Tom was talking about serialization. So when you are initially identifying what a good is, giving it that unique ID, this is an area that BarTender plays very heavily in. And we can tell you that many customers today have manual processes that they are doing to assign some of these serial numbers to goods, and how they're attaching that to the good, that are creating and introducing a lot of errors. So we're working with a major vendor through a serialization process today, and they order ahead of time, 2 weeks ahead of time, a whole bunch of serialized labels, and then they have to manually attach those to the goods and make sure in their system that they've paired everything up correctly. That process, did they order enough this time? Did they order too many? If they ordered too many, where are they keeping those extra labels so that they have them when they need them? Some of those manual processes, instead of doing a print on demand, real time, with connected systems, verifying everything, is an area that we're seeing just at that very kind of digital birth. You're creating some errors that then are going to be in that supply chain through that whole life cycle of that good. So sometimes even just making sure you get things right off the bat, doing, getting rid of your manual processes, automating things and digitizing can really make a massive difference as you're looking at quality.
Yeah, great point, Stan. Now, Nikki, from the retailer perspective, right? All of that data, even a lot of access to new kinds of data they haven't had before. How do retailers deal with this? Because I think we're all, as consumers, have had opportunities where we go to a store and the product's supposed to be there, but it isn't, or it isn't in the place that it should be. How do retailers really look at that?
Yeah, I think I would add one layer to the objects discussion that Tom started, and that would be status. The state or the status of that inventory is just as important as any of the other features or attributes or ways of organizing that data, because it really comes down to, from the retailer perspective, can I sell it or not? So if inventory is in motion and it hasn't been received at a warehouse, increasingly we see retailers very interested in knowing, well, how close is it? Can I reach into and promise that inventory that I have not even taken possession of yet, because I can at least see it. If I can see that it's there, then I could potentially sell it. But if I am going to sell it, then I want to have a process that's going to grab that inventory before it ends up getting routed someplace else. And I got to make sure that that inventory is going to make it to the customer. I think the same thing on the return side. And I think that identification is becoming increasingly an interesting problem there, because once you sell the item, then you deactivate or you remove the tag, right? And so then when the item comes back, how do you get that back reattached to either the original number that you used, or how do you give it a new identifier and a new life so that you can see that inventory again? And again, in apparel, for example, online sales, 30% to 40% of that comes back as returns. So you could actually have a lot of inventory that you could sell, but if you don't know the state of the sellability of that inventory that was returned, then you can't sell it. So I would just say, I think retailers also are thinking about it not just in terms of collecting all of the data and making sure that all of that data is clean, but there's a big context to that data, and that context is becoming more and more important for them to understand. Sort of to your point of new forms of data, I don't know that, we've always had some statuses that are attached to inventory, but these days the amount of statuses and how that rolls up into, well, what can I sell? It's become very complicated and very sophisticated these days.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that, Nikki. Now, when we talk about real time, right, we've really seen that supply chains have accelerated tremendously in the past few decades. I remember back in the 90s when you ordered something from Amazon, it was normal. You ordered a book, you wait for it for 3 weeks. Now consumers order in real time and they expect products to be delivered on very short notice. And retailers order products closer in as well often, and products often get transported more often in smaller quantities. Look, for example, at grocery retailers where they have multiple deliveries per day and in smaller quantity. Now, when we look at agility, agility can really be defined as that ability to react to events, disruptions, and other challenges in real time. Now, according to the survey, a substantial majority of organizations, an overwhelming 85%, we're planning to increase investment in technologies that improve the data quality that we just talked about, as well as traceability within the next 12 months. And it really indicates very strong recognition of that urgency to address the current data deficiencies and also the need to build more resilient, transparent supply chains. So, Dan, as these supply chains demand more real-time execution, how does that impact the technologies being developed to support them? And then how do we move really from kind of historical to predictive and prescriptive?
Right, excellent. Yeah, what I wanted to do is maybe just start out with a few definitions to help people look at this. When we talk about analytics, there's really kind of four things that we often talk about. One is descriptive. So this is a historical of what happened. And one example I kind of wanted to walk through with these different tiers here was I actually worked closely with one company that required semiconductor chips in their product. But what they noticed was that there were certain times that they were really challenged in getting less of them. So descriptive would be something like, we received 30% less fewer chips than we were expecting. Then the next stage is diagnostic, which is why did something happen? And in that case, they saw the chip supplier has a shortage because the vendor is prioritizing other companies. And in this case, what they saw was electric vehicle manufacturers were their top priority, and they were sending those there. So when you look at descriptive and diagnostic, they're both very much historical, looking in the past. And what companies really are starting to move towards are predictive and prescriptive. So predictive allows you to say what will happen. And in this case, with a customer I was working with, they saw that when there were fuel price increases, that often about a month later, they were seeing these chip deliveries being delayed. And so they started to understand some correlations between things so that they could then predict what would happen. And prescriptive gets into more, how can you make something happen? How can you kind of change things based on what you're expecting? And so in this case, the company really just started saying, okay, having these fluctuations, they need to diversify their suppliers. They need to start increasing more of their inventory because they were being impacted so much. So really making sure that you're getting the most out of that data. You're not just looking at what has happened and why that happened, but you're really building towards the future and taking control of that through your data.
Yeah, great answers, Dan. Now, Nikki, retailers are really on the front lines of this, right? How are you seeing them use that technology at the edge to deal with these rapidly changing consumer demand patterns, that real-time demand and the expectation of instant gratification?
Yeah, I mean, I think for sure, back to my omni-channel example, being able to promise every piece of inventory that you have in the store is extremely valuable. I think as well, we see a lot of interest in things like, from the apparel side, fitting rooms, right? How much inventory goes into fitting rooms, how much comes out and goes back on the rack versus actually gets purchased. So I think trying to get into some of those insights that are actionable, right? Like, a lot of people like to talk about the weather and, oh, retailers need to respond to the weather. Well, that's great if you have the supply chain that is fast enough that you can respond to changes in weather. But a lot of times you're talking about 2 or 3 days out, and you can't, shift an entire country's weather inventory to match up to a weather pattern that's going to happen 3 days out. So I think that context of what decision can I make based off of this? If I see a lot of things going into the fitting room and I see them coming out and getting returned to the rack, that is something that is actionable. I can put a discount on it. I can, collect feedback from my stores to say what's wrong with the fit? Something must be wrong with the fit. Why is it all going back to the rack? And then I can make a real decision based off of, what am I going to do with this inventory now if it's clearly not selling at the rate that I expect it to? So I think there's a lot of things that retailers are trying to figure out. Well, it's great to know these things, but what kinds of decisions can I make that will really impact my business? And frankly, I think the question is still an open one. There's a lot of opportunity that is very unexplored here, because you have to get to that point where you have that kind of full visibility at the edge. And I think there's a lot of technology decisions still to be made in terms of how to manage that real-time data, where it doesn't clog up your store network and the communication between store and headquarters, right? That bandwidth is very precious. Even though it's gotten a lot cheaper, still extremely precious. And you kind of have to think about, well, what computing do I put at the edge that lets me handle a lot of this real time, but then lets me take the insights out that I can use at headquarters to make decisions that impact the business.
Yeah, Nikki, very true, right? I mean, insight is so important, but it's really what's the decisions it drives, because that's what's helping companies out. Now, Tom, how do some of the technologies that your company at Zebra offers specifically support this real-time concept and help companies be more agile and responsive to these events and all these disruptions that we're facing?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's a lot more around the specific type of technology used, and more about ubiquity, assets that have this connectivity and that we have visibility into. So, what we're seeing is the cost and demand equation is getting really interesting. What I mean by that is the cost to be able to provide this traceability continues to go down. down to the very low single-digit pennies for RFID tags. Now, just as an example, but even the cost of like video systems for being able to do video intelligence, fixed infrastructure video, or even wearable video offerings that we're seeing, and wearables that we ourselves are making with front-facing cameras that can understand what's happening in an environment, especially when it's coupled with some of the generative AI, LLM, or video language model capabilities. That combined with some of the examples that Nikki and Dan gave around the demand equation, which is that a lot of our customers in the industry need to respond more quickly in a more agile fashion to be able to deliver on the expectations their customers have of them. So that's driving the pull, if you will, from a demand perspective. The cost is enabling it to be more possible and enabling the ROI to pencil more easily. So that's driving certainly a lot of that, and being able to understand where all those assets and people are to orchestrate in real time. And I think a great proxy for this, I guess we all spoke about RFID in some fashion, but I think a great proxy for it is the number of RFID tags deployed on an annual basis. Last year, it was about 53 billion RFID tags, shipped last year, and that was up 17% over 2023 year on year, and it's anticipated will be well over 100 billion tags shipped by 2028. So we're going to double the number of assets just from an RFID point of view that are tagged over the next couple of years only. And that, if I get into that idea of ubiquity, is going to drive a massive amount of traceability, much more agility in the operations, event triggering, event processing, that is going to kind of steer operations much more dynamically. So that's where we're seeing things going, and that the culmination of those proxies that I just described represents some of the fastest growing parts of our business. So we're really excited by that.
Yeah, that's incredible. 100 billion RFID tags. That's a huge number. So now let's look at some of the emerging trends, right? We see obviously the role of new technologies, things like workforce training, but also process innovation that are a huge part in shaping supply chains over the next 5 years. Now, Dan, we've seen tariffs are creating significant disruptions and volatility. How do you see technologies like artificial intelligence and advanced data analytics helping companies make those tactical shifts and truly build resilience in this very unpredictable market?
Yeah, actually, some of the things that we're really seeing is that, obviously with tariffs, there's volatility, but really a lot of things still are driving back into some customer expectations. And we're then seeing some regulations being pushed through to align with some of those customer expectations. So in Europe, there's digital product passport, which is really helping give not just the supply chain visibility into goods and what has gone into them, but the consumers themselves. And there's also a lot around food safety. So food safety in the United States, it's been pushed out now, I think, a year and a half, but the Food Safety Modernization Act. And some of the things that we're seeing, we actually are working a project with the Zebra team right now with a large quick service restaurant chain. And this chain really needed to get visibility into what foods are coming in so they can make sure they have clear understanding of expiration dates. They're on top of things. They can make sure everything's fresh in terms of what they had. They had 70 different suppliers, and a lot of those suppliers were incapable of really being able to share that data with this restaurant chain to be able to help them out. And so being able to, kind of start, building some of these companies up, Tom's talking about, adding more RFID. In this case, these suppliers and growers were having to add RFID tags to all of the different batches that were being shipped out. And so being able to work with all of those companies, get all of them up and running, be able to help with that flow and share of data as it's going between these companies was a big thing that, we as, players in the ecosystem are trying to help. And then on the digital product passport side, we've really been working closely with, we have, just one example, one retailer in Latin America that's very focused on ESG, making sure that their customers have that full transparency into what materials are in the apparel that they're building, how to properly dispose of them, where were they manufactured, was it ethically sourced and manufactured. And so we've been able to work with this company to make sure that they now have, tags on every good, but also when those tags are scanned, to be able to create a website so the user can go in and they can see for their individual good, where was it made, what went into it, and all of this to really align with kind of the heart of what that digital product passport mandate that's going to be coming through in 2030 is all about.
Yeah, there's a lot of complexity in that. And Tom, we know that kind of that shift to autonomous supply chains doesn't just require the tech part, right? It also requires new skills. What do you really see? What do you see with your customers that require it to do workforce training as well as process on innovations to prepare employees to really work alongside these new technologies, work alongside things like AI agents to really leverage those tools effectively?
Yeah, I think, Bart, that's probably one of the most underspoken about, underrated aspects of deploying a lot of this technology is the change management. And there's a great book out there. It's called The Technology Fallacy by MIT Press that outlines that in pretty good detail. And, it really talks about as much as the tech consumes the air in the room and the headlines, it's really not the hard part, especially in new spaces, some of these new areas we're talking about, and trying to scale beyond pilot. It's managing the people change. And what we're seeing, particularly as it relates to these AI agents and implementing those, curiosity is, it may sound simple, but just looking for attracting, engaging with staff members that are curious. Start with people that are demonstrating that curiosity and are genuinely interested in how can they be better at what they do and the services they deliver, and use that part of your organization to model the behavior. And they'll be your early adopters. They'll demonstrate what's possible. They'll remove the fear factor for others. And we found that to be pretty effective, not just within our own four walls, but together with customers, is kind of using that as the first tranche of individuals to adopt these things, prove out where some of the rough spots are, because they want it to work, right? And they want to demonstrate how it can be used and how it can improve their own capabilities and the value they bring. Work through the kinks that way, turn those individuals into champions, and then sort of drive out the change from there. So I think the idea of a big bang, for some of these use cases across the whole organization may not be the best approach, and maybe more along the lines of what I was just describing. And then the other element of this we see, and there's some great examples, like if you think about areas like demand planning and demand forecasting for inventory purposes and so on, there is such a long tail of data that can be used to drive up the accuracy of the prediction. And some of that data is like very high frequency data. So it's impossible really to do it manually. And you're only really going to get the benefit if you use machine learning and AI. And this is, bared itself out. I mean, I think the numbers are something like in that demand planning forecasting space, those organizations that have adopted ML and AI are growing their profitability 20 to 25% ahead of the peers that aren't using that. So I mean, it's pretty well established. And the kinds of high frequency data I'm talking about are things like social platform data, news, events, weather, SKU level accuracy as opposed to category, store level accuracy as opposed to zip code level accuracy. And there's just really no way to do that manually. And so I think when you get people in the mindset of saying, wow, I could do my demand planning just a lot better if I embrace this, but I've got the final say, and I can tweak the final knobs, and I can adjust the model, and I can bring all my years of experience to bear, but I'm going to use it as a tool to help me be better. That goes a really long way in managing the change, as opposed to people interpreting, hey, this AI magic wand is going to do the job for you, which is definitely not the case. We're certainly not there yet, and I don't know if we'll ever quite get completely there. And so positioning it that way and engaging your team members that way, I think is really important. The last thing I'll say, which very much plays into the front line, is crowdsourcing best practices. This is probably most far ahead in manufacturing plant floors, as an example. But when you've got those on the front line that are using these tools and they come up with a new idea, give them the communication, the collaboration, the connected frontline software to be able to share things that they've discovered with the AI so it can improve itself, but also with their peers and give them recognition for doing that, for improving the process because they're living it day in and day out. And that empowers them. It creates better job satisfaction and it reduces overall attrition, which we've quantified. And given the nature of the labor market, which isn't anticipated to improve, that becomes extremely important, perhaps even a competitive advantage. So those are two or three things I'd say that we are seeing, not just within Zebra, but directly with our customers as well.
Yeah, Tom, great points. And I fully agree, right? People will still be at the center of supply chains. You can't just automate everything. Now, Nikki, from the retail perspective, how do you see beyond technology strategic shifts that companies are adopting to drive resilience and how they can use things like data to make better decisions and have confidence in those decisions?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could say that retail has been able to be strategic over the last 5 years. I think from the pandemic and then to tariffs, you can draw a pretty bumpy road between those 2 points to today. And unfortunately, it's been a lot of reactivity. I think even the best of plans to rebuild some resilience, because I think supply chains got thin or brittle, kind of leading up to 2020. And I think that was a realization that lots of companies had, was that things just in time is great when everything runs smoothly, but that's not always going to be the case. And now with tariffs and where do I source from and how is that going to change tomorrow? I think the level of uncertainty is so high that you almost have to really invest much more on the resiliency and as a strategy, as opposed to sort of making strategic decisions about where you're going to source things. So I've seen a lot of frustration, a lot of throwing up of hands, and a lot of I just need to be able to respond to the next thing because I can't predict what that next thing is going to be. I will say I want to pick up on the frontline question of, you can get a lot of ideas over how to use a lot of this data from the front lines. I think with retailers, it's particularly a challenge to actually take advantage of that, right? When you think of the front line, it's either the warehouse worker or it's the store associate. And when you're rolling out something to stores, if you've got 500 stores and you're rolling out 10 stores a week, that's 50 weeks before you reach every store, right? Just the nature of stores makes that very difficult. So I think one of the things that happens is that retailers roll through and then they're like, we'll see you in 2 years. And in the meantime, those frontline workers have 2 years of accumulated either frustrations or great ideas that are just falling on deaf ears because nobody's there to listen to them. And I think part of resiliency is you can't roll out things in 1 year or 2 year time horizons. You really have to be continuously improving even as you're introducing new things, because you have to be able to go back and give the people who are the early stages of adoption the reassurance that when they have identified something that is a blocker, you're going to do something to remove that blocker and not, declare victory and then come back, 2-3 years from now.
Yeah, very, very true points, Nikki. And, it's very important for companies to create this culture of innovation that's kind of a two-way street, which you really need to listen to your employees as well, what they see, stumbling blocks and the ideas they can bring, create a culture around that, because that really helps as well with talent attraction and retention. And as Tom mentioned before, our work population isn't growing, rather it's shrinking. So it's very important how companies position themselves from that perspective as well. Now, if we look ahead at the future, and again, I'm not trying to make you look in a crystal ball, but we need to understand what future-ready supply chain technology looks like in the next decade. It's more about how are you ready for that technology by 2030, because we know technology changes and advances quite rapidly. Supply chains continue to change. So Dan, if you look ahead at 2030, not what's happening in 2030, but what are some steps that companies initially need to take right now to make sure they prepare their supply chains to be future ready?
I mean, one thing that comes to mind for me is I read a study by TSIA that was saying that companies who are using and analyzing their own operational data are seeing 10% higher increase in revenue over those that aren't. So when you really start thinking about data and what are you doing, number one is you really need to make sure that you are generating the data and you're capturing that data first off the bat. And for a medium to large size business, that's easy. For a smaller business, that can be more challenging. However, with the tools that are out there, it's really been, those doors have been opened up for everyone, and really trying to then take AI to allow it to use for automating of actionable insights. So really like dive into that technology, understand what you have, and be able to build towards those solutions. And because ultimately, when we look even in just a few short years to 2030, there are businesses who will be doing that, and they will be light years ahead of those that aren't, right? So just making sure that you have that strong data strategy and AI strategy on top of that to improve the business.
Dan, that's some strong statistics, right? 10% revenue improvement. I heard Tom earlier talk about 20 to 25% more profitability. That's huge, right? I mean, if that's not motivation to really look at this, I don't know what is. But Tom, if we want to get started with things like more item level tracking and visibility, how should companies look at these emerging technologies, and what should they do now to make sure they get to that level?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things I'm always amazed at is the diversity and the, how wide the deviation is among operating on a clipboard with pen and paper to, some, semi-automated or fully automated data capture environments using combinations of like vision technology, computer vision, and RFID and so on. And it's just a really wide spectrum. So I would say, as I said, this isn't just me, but it's a little bit beyond the data story, but just very quickly, there was a recent, and it got a lot of headlines out there. I think it was a Wall Street Journal headline as well. It was a report by MIT on the use of AI and the number of stalled pilots, if you will, in the deployment, right? But there was really two key takeaways, and it very much applies to this data story as well, that determined the difference between those that were successful and those that weren't. And this report was just out in like the last month. And the first thing they highlighted was picking the right domain. And the way they said it was focus on a narrow but a high value use case, integrate deeply into the workflow, and then scale through continuous learning. And I think that picks up on some of the items that maybe Nikki mentioned earlier, which is, don't necessarily try to create this universal broad brush architecture for how am I going to do data collection before you get started, and I'm going to get everything right from a data dictionary and every different way I'm going to go and collect that. Start with a use case that you can pencil the ROI on. Think about things like automated inventory receiving or food safety or better forecasting, as I mentioned earlier, or automating repetitive tasks that are just sucking up productivity cycles in an already constrained labor environment. Pick one of those or one of the others that is very much implemented now. Go get the value out of it. And then once you've got that going, hang ornaments, if you will, off that initial tree, right? Like go get the win, focus on a use case, and then kind of build it out from there. And the second thing I would say, and I'm out meeting with customers actually this week across Europe, I got to tell you, there's a marked uptick in the number of customers that are committed to not going alone, if you know what I mean by that. Like there used to be this sort of, hey, we'll build it ourselves, and there's all this competitive advantage we're going to have by staying insular and understanding how things, work and keeping the details scarce to our partners and things like that. More and more, I'm noticing many customers, and sometimes this is through leadership changes that are happening within these organizations, are really saying, hey, to move at the velocity I need to move at, the speed I need to move at, I've got to do it together with partners. And that was another output from the study, that MIT study that said the second most important thing besides picking the right domain was picking the right partners, and that solutions or offerings in these areas that are leverage specialized vendors are twice as likely to succeed than internal developments. And rather than picking on a Zebra example, I'll use Dan's organization, which acquired a company called Mojix, where Mojix very much focused on the food safety side of things. And like if that's a use case you're going to go after, Emojic's food safety software with the Zebra hardware and the RFID front, leverage us. And, you're, according to MIT, like more, twice as likely to be successful than if you try to piece that all together yourself. So those are kind of the two points I'd make, and, go get a win and then build out from there.
Yeah, very great points, and definitely agree. Partnership, especially with open platforms as we have today, makes it a lot easier. And so you have to look at vendors that partner and provide a much broader platform that you can help you be more, I would say more effective and a higher chance of success in those projects. Now, Nikki, from the retailer side, how will technology unlock new potential for retailers and maybe even new income opportunities?
Yeah, I think there's lots of potential there, and I think it does have to kind of grow organically internally. So to Tom's point, that you pick something and start there, and then once you kind of get on the learning curve, then you can see where you can take that. Whereas if you try to kind of cover every base or solve every problem all at once, you're just never going to get there. I mean, I see companies who say, I can't get started on an inventory, serialization project until I have accurate inventory. It's like, you're never going to start then. Like you should start this project so that you can get inventory accuracy as a side effect or as a main effect. But it's sort of like, I'm never going to have kids until I can afford to have kids. Well, you're never going to have kids. So I think that mentality is an important precursor to being able to take advantage of the future. I think ubiquity is probably the one area where I would say retailers do need to prepare themselves for. They need to understand, you are going to be generating reams more data than you've ever generated before. How are you going to manage that? You need to prepare for. A lot of retailers already have a lot of identification under their roofs already, and are not taking advantage of it because their brand manufacturers are already tagging things, are already serializing inventory and sending it to them. And so I think, thinking through, you don't have to wait until you have 100% coverage in your store before you start installing readers in your store, before you start looking at how you're managing serialized inventory at your point of sale and tracking that you sold this particular item. So there's definitely, like, the seeds of the future are already planted today. And I do think retailers are starting to look around much more at what these longer term implications are, so that they can be better prepared for when we hit some of that ubiquity in 2030, for sure.
Yeah, very, very true, right? And I would say, sometimes with AI, don't think of it as this huge project. There's some things that are very, very simple, but they're just very, very high in occurrence, right? Supply chains, we do billions and billions of transactions a year. So there are easy things to start with, but they have a huge impact. And again, have a huge impact on people's job that could really help them like their jobs better. And again, that helps with that whole talent attraction and retention. So at this point, we'll go to some of the questions we've had from the audience, and we've actually had a pretty good question here that really talks about real-time data. How can companies really think about or determine where they need real-time data versus where they maybe can still use batch data, right? Because, for example, in logistics, an area that I lived a long time, we still see a lot of EDI, and we know EDI a lot of times is batch. It's not always real time. We don't always use API for everything. How do you make that decision? I don't know, maybe Tom or Dan, if you can respond to that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm happy to start, and then I'll turn it over to Dan just real quickly. One of the ways that we've seen be very effective around that is listing out the use cases, as undoubtedly customers will do, and organizations will do, is look at all these, what are the outcomes and the use cases they can go and generate, and then use some merit. What's the return on investment? What's the size of the prize for each one of those from a business perspective? And then what we've done with some customers is added to that matrix, what data do you need access to in order to realize that use case? Do you already have access to that data? If you don't have access to that data, can you get access to that data through a partner? And if you can't, what is it going to cost you to be able to get access to the data? And it sort of then becomes almost like a secondary ranking on the use cases, because obviously if you've got a high value impact use case from an outcome perspective, and it's data you already have access to, but you just haven't implemented it, those are some of the obvious first places to go. probably a lot of that low-hanging fruit's already been taken advantage of. And then you'll move down the list to say, well, we haven't done this one. Well, why haven't we done it? Because we don't have access to A, B, and C. And oh, that data is relatively straightforward for us to get. And that sort of then starts to feed into the equation. So it's kind of mapping that out. And instead of just thinking about the business case, it's thinking about the data case. Like what data do I need to make the case for this outcome? And that's been really effective. It's not overly difficult to do, and it's pretty understandable when you're trying to get stakeholders bought in internally in the organization as well, because you can very quickly demonstrate the opportunity cost because you've got the long list. Like if we don't do this, the alternative is this other thing, which is probably worse, or something we've already done. And then it kind of gets people in the mindset of, hey, I need to act.
Right. Very good. Dan, I'll give you the opportunity also to add if you want, but also we talked a little about things like traceability, labeling, and we talked about compliance, but what do you see as some of the untapped business value that companies often miss by using this data, whether it's real time or not real time?
I didn't have too much to add on to what Tom answered. I think he really dialed in on that one pretty well. I think maybe the only other thing that I would add is, he talked about the customer's desired outcome and what's your desired outcome. Oftentimes we get fixated on how we're going to attain that. And, I've had many examples, we're in a software environment. You think of one path to get there, and then you realize I don't have access to this data, or there's a challenge here. Sometimes you can hit nearly the same desired outcome through a different path. So there may be things that you already have access to that maybe it's a different path, but you can still get back into that same area. So sometimes taking that step back, re-looking at, is there a different method to get back to where you're looking at, is one. And then I forgot, Bart, what was the second part of the question?
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
so we talked about compliance and how labeling and traceability data helps with that. But do you see like any untapped business value that companies often miss that they just don't think about when looking at all that data?
It's interesting. I was just in a workshop with partners yesterday, and we were talking about how being there were bartender resellers. We're talking about these customers who we work with who are doing labeling. But then the next step, once you're doing labeling, how are these companies tracking the things they have? And we actually found that it's pretty common to talk to companies. They're putting their labels on, and they're not fully taking advantage of what they can do then with it, that their views into their inventory, what's going in, what's coming out, how efficiently they're running things are not where they need to be. And so sometimes, really just taking some of those next steps and, asking some of those questions, what else can you do with some of these technologies and the data that you've deployed so that you can get that additional business value. So, some companies are all on top of that, but I would say that's an internal view. And then there's the external view. That data sharing across supply chain, it's pretty limited at this state. And that's a key area of really making sure that you're storing your data in a way that aligns with standards and connecting very tightly with whether it's your suppliers, your distributors, whatever that is, to make sure that you have those open data sets so that you can pull and exchange data back and forth.
Awesome. Well, I think we could continue this discussion for at least a few more hours, but we've come to the end of the time. If people do have any further questions, please feel free to reach out. I want to thank our experts on today's webinar, but I also want to thank the audience for your time as well as for your questions. And we look forward to seeing you on the next webinar. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Cool.